Right, so hello and welcome again to our second event in our US election series. This is being recorded, so please bear that in mind. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Zalfa Figali. I am your moderator for this evening, hopefully better than some other moderators we've seen in recent debates. If you were here last week, welcome back. If you're joining us for the first time, hello. This is a chance for you to chat to us, and genuinely we can have a conversation. It just doesn't have to just be questions in the chat bar. You can talk to various academics in the Center for American Studies. We're here to talk about the US elections and how they connect to the Americas more broadly. In various configurations over the next 3 weeks, we're going to be talking about the movement for Black Lives and its relationship to the upcoming elections. And we will offer, in theory, some pre and post-election analysis. So thank you all in advance to my colleagues who have given up time, dinner time in my case, to join us this evening and every subsequent evening until the 5th of November. I said it last week, and I will say it again here. This is a really nice space, I hope, for some respectful and collaborative conversations. Even though the humanities are constantly under attack from institutions that don't understand their value, we understand their importance. So I think these events are a chance for us to display our intellectual acumen and demonstrate how undeniably critical our disciplines really are. This is your job as well, students, do it. We're going to have these 3 talks this evening. So obviously keep your microphones muted during that time. You are more than welcome during the chat, during the talks, to put a question into the chat. We won't answer it then, but we will certainly go through all the questions we possibly can. You can also use your vocal cords and raise your hand and actually ask a question. So we will call on you. Don't be afraid. So a couple of introductions. You probably know us all already, but I am delighted to introduce 2 of my friends and my colleagues. We have Deborah Toner, who I'm sure has taught many of you. Her research hinges on the social and cultural importance of alcohol, colonialism and colonialist discourse, and indigenous histories of the Americas, of course. I'm going to speak after Deborah, and I'm going to be talking about a range of incoherent things, including Alexander Hamilton and the musical. After me, Dr. Alex Wadden, who you all know and adore as our resident election whisperer, one way or another, is Associate Professor in American Politics and US Foreign Policy. So I know you'll be listening very closely to him today and over the next week as he talks about the elections. So that's all I have to say. I will mute myself now, but Deborah, go for it.
Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much, Zalfa, for that lovely introduction. And I hope I don't waffle on too disjointedly about various things, but basically my plan is to make a few remarks about a couple of key issues that are very pertinent to the Americas as a whole right now. First of all, climate change and environmental issues, and secondly, the coronavirus pandemic, and how key aspects, I guess, of the current Trump administration and the outcome of the November election might have a bearing on the situation in both respects in other parts of the Americas. So I'm going to concentrate particularly on Brazil and Mexico. So first of all, I'm thinking about the issue of climate change and environmental protections and damage to the environment. We saw in the first set of debates between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, as well as the vice presidential candidate, that issues of sustainability and environmentalism are really going to be a key outcome of this election in terms of the direction that the US will take, depending on whether we have a Trump or a Biden victory. And one of the newspapers that I've been following in tracing how the US election's being seen elsewhere is the Yucatan Times, who made this point just about a week ago in an article saying that the United States' commitment to sustainability and environmentalism in the future will be decided in this critical election. So one key point that the Yucatan Times has been reflecting on from Mexico's point of view is Biden's discussion of his climate plan, particularly in how it takes seriously the relationship between climate change and racial injustice, pointing to the realities of how climate change disproportionately affects Black, Indigenous and people of colour communities around the world. Key features of Biden's climate plan, as he's discussed since around the middle of the summer up until the recent weeks, include a 4-year spending plan of $2 trillion US, aiming to target zero carbon emissions in the energy sector by 2035, prioritizing green job creation and upgrading the energy efficiency standards of domestic homes and also workplace buildings as well. Importantly, particularly for our topic this evening, on an international level, he's made a commitment to rejoin the Paris Agreement, from which Trump withdrew during the course of his first presidency, hopefully his only presidency. And as part of that rejoining of the Paris Agreement would be committing high levels of financial support to combat climate change in developing nations. On the other side of the current election debate, then we've seen Trump and his vice presidential candidate Pence lambast Biden's plan as an attack on the fossil fuel industry, an attack on the US economy, defending things like fracking. And in their public statements, they completely or even at times completely deny that climate change is a significant threat to the US and to the global community. So it's clear that a Trump victory in November would mean continued deregulation of the fossil fuel industry and probably little to no direct action to support environmental and sustainability challenges, either domestically or overseas. And so thinking then about what kind of impact this would have elsewhere in the Americas, the first point I want to make is that this would a Trump victory and that approach to climate change and the environment in the United States would give further encouragement and legitimacy to how the second biggest economic player in the Western Hemisphere, Brazil, has been dealing with environmental and indeed other challenges in the last couple of years, as Brazil, with their president Jair Bolsonaro since 2018, has been following a very Trumpian agenda in environmental terms and indeed in many other terms since that time. So at the end of 2018, being confirmed at the beginning of 2019, Jair Bolsonaro was elected president of Brazil. And his electoral campaign was marked by, amongst other things, his praise for the military dictatorships of the 1960s to 1980s in Brazil, support for authoritarian and violent policing, including a sort of kill first, ask questions later policy, very misogynistic and anti-LGBTQ rhetoric, a commitment to stripping Brazil's indigenous peoples of their land reserves by force, if necessary, to enable expansions of the mining industries, and a fire sale of environmental protections to enable the expansion of particularly the timber or logging industries and the expansion of different agricultural and farming enterprises, particularly cattle farming and soya farming. Since his election, the effects of those environmental policies, and it should be stressed as well, their implications for social justice, have already proven to be highly damaging. So 2019 was a record year for fires and deforestation in the Amazon regions of Brazil. And so far, at any rate, in 2020, as the fire season typically starts in and around August, this has been even worse so far in 2020. These types of fires do happen every year, but their scale and impact has increased exponentially in the last couple of years. They are usually caused by processes of land clearing to enable cattle farming, other forms of farming and mining operations, and the burning of trees that are considered sort of waste byproducts of logging operations. So effectively, timber that can't be profitably sold. But Bolsonaro's response to these record years of fires affecting the Amazon region this year and indeed in 2019 are to claim that the reports of these fires are false. Essentially, he's claimed that international media, NGOs and other organisations are lying that this is taking place. Also, his response has been to fire or sack many leading scientists who've been studying the effects of deforestation in Brazil, and in addition defunding government and non-governmental agencies that are charged with preventing illegal mining and deforestation operations, which have been rapidly increasing in the last 2 years. Coming back to the presidential campaign, Biden specifically mentioned the destruction of the Amazon in the first presidential debate, pledging to cooperate internationally to provide $20 billion to stop Amazonian deforestation, and if Brazil's non-compliant, to threaten them with some form of economic sanctions. And Bolsonaro's response was to call these cowardly threats on social media. So Bolsonaro, as president of Brazil, will clearly be hoping for a Trump victory in November. And we have every reason to assume that that would result in further damage to the Amazonian rainforest. And in turn, thinking about the even bigger picture here, that has implications for the global struggle against climate change, since the Amazon is such a major site of biodiversity and absorber of carbon dioxide gases, which have an impact on global rates of temperature rise. Now, there are many other similarities and synergies between Bolsonaro's style of leadership and that of Trump: anti-intellectualism, racialized politics, support for violence-led policing, and coming on to my second issue that I want to talk about, denialism in terms of dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. So after the United States, which has suffered to date the highest number of coronavirus deaths in the world, at around, as of today, around 217,000 people have lost their lives in the US, Brazil comes in second in that unfortunate league table, having suffered almost 152,000 deaths. Similarly to how Trump has done in the United States, and notably despite both men having contracted the virus themselves, Bolsonaro has consistently claimed in public that COVID-19 is not a serious health condition. He's criticised state governors for adopting quarantine measures. He's encouraged public protests about mask wearing and other safety restrictions. So there's lots of similarities between Brazil and between the presidents of Brazil and the United States in this regard. A less obvious bedfellow in terms of how they've been dealing with coronavirus in the Americas is also the current Mexican president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, commonly referred to as AMLO for his initials. So until India overtook Mexico last month, Mexico had suffered the third highest number of coronavirus deaths in the world and is still fourth in that horrible league table with around 85,000. And this figure is actually widely believed to be significantly underreported. So the actual figure is believed to be much higher in Mexico. Much like Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro, Mexico's president has very publicly refused to wear a mask, but in his case connects it to a different kind of populist rhetoric about overcoming the country's corruption problem. So back in July, he declared that he'll wear a mask when there is no corruption left affecting the country. And so while kind of occupying a similar populist public space, or political space rather, as Bolsonaro in Brazil and Trump in the US. In contrast to those two, AMLO operates with a more left-wing platform, at least in some respects. But in terms of dealing with the coronavirus pandemic, Mexico's government and particularly its president has been equally, if not more, criticised than those other two. His government has stuck to a severe programme of economic austerity for key institutions that are needed to fight the pandemic, particularly public health authorities and hospitals. So this has severely limited Mexico's ability to test significant numbers of the population. It's put lots of pressure on hospitals being able to care for people. And healthcare workers in Mexico are at much higher risk of dying from COVID-19 than they are in the United States and Brazil, as a direct result, really, of these governmental policies. So while AMLO represents a more left-wing form of populism than Trump, at least in of things like social welfare provision for the very poorest in society, and in terms of racial politics within Mexico, López Obrador enjoys a more cordial relationship with the Trump administration than you might expect, both in terms of those political differences on domestic terms, but also when you think back to the 2016 presidential election campaign in the United States, where Trump had lots to say about Mexican migrants, Mexican Americans, and the US-Mexico border. Most of what Trump had to say on those subjects was extremely inflammatory and derogatory. So you wouldn't as a result of that, assume that there'd be quite cordial relationships between the Trump presidency and Mexico's current president. Now, I know Zalfa is going to talk a bit about migration and issues to do with that in different parts of the Americas in respect to our topic today. So I'm just going to wrap up then with a couple of points about the US-Mexico border and the much discussed border wall that was a key feature of Trump's 2016 electioneering, effectively asking whatever happened to that wall. Well, first of all, Trump still talks about it quite a lot. So in addition to preventing dangerous criminals, drugs and terrorists from entering the US via Mexico, in July this year, Trump claimed that his wall was the only reason the United States hadn't been inundated with coronavirus. Secondly, parts of this wall do exist. So around 650 miles of the 2,000-mile US-Mexico border is marked by some kind of barrier. These barriers range from 18-foot iron fencing to much more makeshift and ramshackle barbed wire fences and other obstructions. Trump has declared aspirations to build concrete walls covering anything from between another 500 to 1,000 miles at different points in time. But in reality, a significant amount of the wall building funds that he has managed to procure have gone towards updating or improving already existing border structures. And you'll also probably remember that Trump said he would make Mexico pay for his wall. Mexico didn't, and to date it's accounted for around $15 billion of US government funds. What does Biden have to say on the future of the wall should he win? He would cease to expand it, but not dismantle whatever is there at the moment. And does it work on its own terms in terms of what Trump wanted it to do? So a public policy center at the University of Pennsylvania has published various reports saying it does little to stop drug trafficking. Most cross-border migrants are seeking employment rather than fleeing from criminal prosecution or the justice system in Mexico or states further south. And the US State Department itself has found that there's no credible evidence that terrorist organizations use northern Mexico as a route to enter the US. And I will make no comment on the wall's effectiveness in stopping coronavirus.
I nearly had mute gate there. Thank you, Deborah. Right. I am not going to be as put together or coherent as Deborah's talk was. Apologies, but I'm going to have a go. I will touch on the U.S.-Mexico border at some point, hopefully slightly coherently. So some of you might know, and my partner, who suffers a lot with this, does, that I'm almost always at the edge of breaking into song. And usually that song is a song from the musical Hamilton. So I'm not going to talk or sing much. You'll be glad to know about the musical, but I have used it in my teaching in a range of ways to think about, among other things, narratives about Americanness and immigration. So tonight I want to evoke it for a similar purpose, to think about the upcoming US election, obviously, in relation to the broader hemispheric Americas. So throughout the musical, you see a lot of incredulity and xenophobia about Hamilton's background as an immigrant, expressed by the fictionalized and musicalized Aaron Burr, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson. And this is the first time I discovered these people exist, obviously. The musical is fantastic. I'm joking, of course. But you only get this when they disagree with him. When they disagree with him, he's a bastard orphan son of a whore, or he's this immigrant who is someone we didn't choose. My students and I, probably mainly I, have talked a lot about the problems with the way that history is told and potentially whitewashed musical. But leaving that aside for a bit, I think it's interesting to see the development of Alexander Hamilton as an immigrant at the beginning of the musical, and then properly cast, properly described at the end, even by his political enemies, as a fellow founding father. So Hamilton is seen as an immigrant and not a real American because he grew up on an island in the Caribbean, which he leaves after it is basically destroyed by a hurricane. He leaves and goes to New York. Today, Alexander Hamilton or people like him might have been covered by a program called Temporary Protected Status, or TPS, even been able to make a claim for asylum in the United States. TPS is a program that gives special legal status to people from specific countries that have been hit by wars or natural disasters and so on. And on the country list at the moment, here's my list: Haiti, Syria, Sudan, South Sudan, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Somalia, Nepal, Yemen, and a couple more that keep floating on and off. The TPS is interesting, and it's interesting to me because it's a program that the Trump administration has repeatedly tried to dismantle and remove loads of what we would call deserving countries off of. The courts haven't let that happen, so they keep telling people, oh, get ready, you're going to be taken off the list. You need to get ready to leave to go back to where you're from. Oh, no, the courts have said we can't do that. So it's not a great quality of life if you're somebody who's living in the US under temporary protected status. But I want to focus on a couple of these countries currently on the TPS list, Haiti, Honduras, and El Salvador, to try and map out what they have to do with the coming election. So I start with Haiti. After its really devastating earthquake in 2010, the Obama administration put Haiti on the TPS list. And during the 2016 presidential campaign, Trump dropped hints that he supported this program, that he supported TPS, and he told the crowd in Miami's Little Haiti, rather, Little Miami. He said, whether you vote for me or don't vote for me, I really want to be your greatest champion, and I will be your champion. Unsurprisingly, he is a liar. Soon after that, months after that, the Trump administration began framing TPS as a scam that people were using to illegally trick their way into staying in the US indefinitely without having just cause to do so. And very specifically, the administration started warning Haitians in the US who were protected under this program that they needed to get ready to go back to Haiti. So what happened there? A lot of these people end up trying to leave to go back to a more hospitable country, or to go to a more hospitable country. They couldn't go back to Haiti for various kind of reasonable reasons. They got on planes, they got on trains, they got in cars and cabs, and they made their way not to the US-Mexico border, this most porous of borders apparently, but over to the Canada-US border. They crossed over the longest undefended border in the world into Canada. Now, of course, there's a long history of groups of people fleeing the US across this very specific border. We might think of formerly enslaved people, Frederick Douglass, who I mentioned last week, and others who traveled on the Underground Railroad. And we understand Canada here, of course. This is based on an understanding of Canada as this very kind or kinder, more hospitable place in comparison to the United States. Though I would probably say that Indigenous people in Canada have a 1 or 2 or 7,000 things to say about that. So that's my spiel about the North. I will talk about the US-Mexico border, where we can think about its relationship to people from Honduras and El Salvador who are protected under TPS protections, I suppose. And Honduras and El Salvador are two countries that are on that are in a list that are described as the Northern Triangle, the so-called Northern Triangle. The other country is Guatemala. It's not on the TPS list, even though it has the highest, I think it's the third highest, the last time I checked, incidence of femicide in the world. That's the wanton murder of women, if you don't know what femicide means. So you might have heard a little bit about the Northern Triangle before, or at least one of the countries in them. Scholars will cite a really poor quality of life, daily human rights abuses, suffering in the aftermath of civil wars, and these civil wars very often funded by the US government directly or indirectly, dangerously high crime rates, no rule of law, a lot of food insecurity, gang violence, femicide. And these are just some of the reasons that there has been what I'm going to call a crisis in these countries that manifests at the US-Mexico border for about the last 20 years. So we know the current crisis at the US-Mexico border has been widely documented, stemming, of course, as Deborah said, from Trump's campaign promise to build a wall and make Mexico pay for it. And it's symptomatic, of course, of a broader climate of xenophobia and nationalism in the US. So following the triggering of the National Emergencies Act in February 2019, Trump's presidential proclamation then claimed that, and I quote, "The southern border is a major entry point for criminals, wrong, gang members, wrong, and illicit narcotics," okay, fine, which constitutes a national emergency. And this was the triggering of this National Emergencies Act. But his narrow narrative glosses over a huge problem in terms of the continuous nature of violence experienced in that region and in specific countries in South America, and ignores the mundane securitization of this place. It's every day, it's militarized, it's securitized. It also, and this is what I want to kind of speak for the rest of my time about, it makes no mention of innocent people trying to get across the border. Specifically, I'm interested in thinking about children or minors attempting to enter the United States. We call these unaccompanied children. For those of us who work on these narratives, unaccompanied minors, unaccompanied children. So I want to suggest, in a kind of worldwide first that's actually being recorded, that I do agree with Donald Trump that there is a crisis at the US-Mexico border. It is unprecedented, this emergency, but the crisis is not an immigration or a crime or a drug or a terror crisis, but in fact a children's crisis, which has been deepening over the last decade and stretches back across at least the last 20 years and has been largely ignored. According to a report by the University of Chicago's International Human Rights Clinic, and try to get your head around these numbers now because they're just staggering. In each year between 2003 and 2011, between 7,000 and 8,000 unaccompanied children were transferred by basically Border Patrol, but Customs and Border Protection, so CPB, to the Office of Resettlement and Refugees. So basically, that many people, that many young people in those years, 7,000 to 8,000 a year. But what we've seen in the last 9 to 10 years, however, is that the number of unaccompanied children arriving at the US-Mexico border increasing exponentially. And this is an accurate term of an exponential increase, an accurate use of the term. 102,000 apprehended between April 2014 and August 2015. This is the period of the so-called immigration spike that Trump used at the time to stoke up these fears. 54,000 unaccompanied children traveling alone. These aren't children separated from their families. These are children traveling alone. 54,000 in 2018, over 70,000 in 2019. And I'll be completely honest, I could not bear earlier today to look at the numbers from this year. So the crisis then is not new, but it is acute at this moment in time. Unaccompanied children are traveling to the US through Mexico and manifesting at this very specific border in record numbers. And if their solo journey is successful, it's incredibly dangerous to travel from the Northern Triangle, the two countries on the TPS list. It's incredibly dangerous to get there. But if they do get there and don't die or get murdered or kidnapped or trafficked, then they have to navigate the labyrinths of the US immigration system. And it's worth reminding people here, it is actually not a criminal act to attempt to cross the US-Mexico border. At best, it's a misdemeanor. So this rhetoric all around it is entirely, as we know, made up. So I'm coming to the end now. What does this have to do with Hamilton or the election? Obviously, well, the Department of Homeland Security, which was created, as we know, in the wake of September 11th, has been an important tool of key Trump administration policies from the start, enforcing stricter immigration policies, building the border wall, of course, separating families apprehended trying to enter the US, and doing loads of other very fun and inhuman stuff. The DHS, of course, is part of Trump's law and order platform, stirring up anti-immigrant sentiment in the same way that he did in 2016. And what does it have to do with Hamilton? Well, Hamilton was either 13 or 15 when he arrived in Boston and made his way to the US, made his way to New York. That makes him a child refugee or an unaccompanied child migrant, depending on how you want to look at it. So when we think about unaccompanied children today applying for asylum or people whose TPS or immigration status is being constantly called into question, that isn't widely disconnected, I think, from the story of our $10 founding father. That's me done. I think we have, thank you, Dad. I think we have Alex. Are you good to go?
I'm ready to go, yeah. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming along this evening. A couple of things before I start, actually. My connectivity's dropped a couple of times. If it does that again, I'm going to switch computers. The problem with that is that you'll see the full-scale mess in the bedroom rather than just what you can see at the moment. Also, my wife's probably going to arrive home at any moment, which will bring on a full-scale dog barking with happiness that they don't just have me to look at. So please bear that in mind, folks. Okay, I'm going to talk in a much sort of, I think, more narrower lane in some ways and less imaginative lane than Zalfa and Deborah. I'm going to and there will be some overlap, I think, in terms of some of the things I say. So I'm going to talk about the stakes, I guess, involved in terms of immigration policy in the election. So I'll start by talking a little bit actually about Obama's record as president in terms of immigration policy, given that Biden was critical to that and was actually quite often the point person in trying to explain and justify some of the harsher aspects, shall I say, of Obama's immigration policy. And some of the confusions in that policy, then go over some maybe familiar ground in terms of Trump's appeal in 2015, 2016, and how he built his political identity around the issue of immigration that was crucial to his emergence as a candidate in 2015-16. I'll talk about some of the things that the Trump administration has done, and you can get quite into the weeds, and I'll try not to get lost in some of the details of what they've done, particularly in terms of asylum policy, which is really quite complicated. And then I'll think a little bit about what's at stake and how Biden's emerged as what Biden offers as an alternative to Trump in terms of the promises that he's making about immigration. Think a little bit about public opinion over the course of the Trump years, and then a few thoughts on Latinx vote in the 2020 election. Although one of the things I'll say is using that, thinking of the Latino vote as a coherent bloc is a misguided way of approaching the matter. Okay, the Obama record. I mean, Obama did, in some ways, sort of. I'm not sure "earn" is quite the right word, but was referred sometimes as the deporter in chief in terms of his record, and because record numbers of people were deported. It's a slightly misleading to say record numbers because the records don't go back that far in terms of the count. So it's not, that's perhaps a comparison of Clinton and Bush and Obama rather than, and it doesn't take into account relative numbers and all those sorts of things. But there was the Obama administration did deport a lot of people. Now, again, the numbers are a little bit misleading because a lot of those people who were at the border rather than people who had been living in the US for a considerable amount of time, but quite a number of people from Central America, families were deported by ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And if you wanted to present the Obama record in a more liberal light, you'd emphasize some of the efforts that they'd made to promote legislation which would have provided pathways to legal status for many undocumented immigrants in the US. And really, I should preface this by saying the debate about immigration, there's an important and interesting debate about legal immigration and who should be allowed into the US, who should be given green cards and legal status. But in many ways, the real intensity of the debate is around undocumented aliens. And again, the language in the US context would really matter. If you talk about illegal immigrants or undocumented aliens, it really places where you are in that debate. So if you talk about people who are undocumented, it suggests you're on the liberal side of the argument. If you talk about illegal, it suggests you're on the illegal by definition is illegal. And so you're on the more conservative side, and people have committed a crime in being in the US without papers or committed an offence of some sort. I think Zalfa was clear what is a crime and isn't now. So the other things in terms of the Obama record on this, he wasn't able to get legislation through. And I will bore first and finally a student stupid explaining the complexities of the legislative process over the next few weeks as to why it was so difficult. Even in 2009, 2010, when the Democrats controlled both chambers, they weren't able to get the so-called DREAM Act through Congress. 5 Democrats bolted in Senate, which would have got that through. In legislative terms, there was a major effort in 2013-14 to push legislation through. A comprehensive immigration reform act did pass Congress, passed by 68 votes to 32. There were 14 Republicans who joined with the Democrats to push that through. And the issue is whether the House of Representatives would take up any sort of similar legislation. The head count was quite clear that if they did and had a free vote on that legislation, it would have passed. You would have got some sort of comprehensive immigration reform package, which would have given a pathway to legal status for many millions of people living without papers in the US. The mechanics of that was that what you would have got was all Democrats voting with a handful of Republicans to get that legislation passed. The Republicans controlled the House. John Boehner, who was a Speaker of the House, simply didn't want to pass legislation on that basis. He didn't want a minority of his caucus voting with all Democrats to pass major legislation. And I think Boehner has almost expressed regret about that since then, never quite acknowledging his role in that. It should be said, the chances, again, just thinking about party dynamics and political dynamics, the chance that Boehner would act completely vanished in early 2014 when his number 2, Eric Cantor, who was a senior Republican, number 2 in the Republican caucus, a House member from Virginia, was defeated in his primary by a guy called Dave Bratt for his seat in Virginia. And Bratt's attack on Cantor was that Cantor was too wet, too liberal on immigration matters. And once that had happened, it was clear that the Republican base was going to be motivated and would certainly be demotivated if the Republicans gave any further ground on immigration policy. And so that sort of put a full stop to any idea that Boehner might try and get similar legislation to that passed in the Senate, passed in the House. So that ends the possibility of anything in the Obama years through legislation. Obama does then eventually try to get things through on executive action. Most importantly, or most long-lastingly, we get the Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals program, the DACA program, which was actually introduced in mid-2012. And this was the program for those people who do lots of qualifications about who could apply, etc. But people who'd arrived in the US, crossed the border without papers, illegally, choose your own words, as children who were in the 20s, early 30s, who effectively were Americans to all intents and purposes, but simply didn't have the papers to prove that. And this was a way of the Obama administration, through executive action, offered a way in which these people could claim temporary legal status on a rolling 2-year basis, which would have to be renewed. They also tried to introduce, and the estimates were about 1.5 million people might apply for DACA. In the end, about 800,000 people applied for that temporary legal status through the DACA program. At the end of 2014, the Obama administration tried to go further than this with something called DAPA, which is Deferred Action for the Parents of Childhood Arrivals, which would have covered about 4 to 5 million people. I know that's a broad range, but they were the estimates. About 4 to 5 million people living without papers would have been able to find a way to legal status through DAPA. Again, it wouldn't have been permanent legal status. You can't do that for executive action, but it would have been temporary legal status. That was not back in the courts. Okay, the court said that that was too much of a stretch of executive authority. And to be honest, I think most legal minds, whether you agree or disagree, I certainly would agree with the principle behind DAPA, but most legal experts thought it was certainly a stretch. And one of Obama's problems with that, there were 23 times in public where he said he couldn't do that, that would be breaching his executive authority, and then so he did it, so rather hoist by his own petard in that sense. Okay, quickly moving on. So a mixed record in terms of the Obama administration, Obama-Biden administration. It looks less mixed, I guess, when you compare it to what's happened since. I think everybody knows that Trump's, when he announced his candidacy for the presidency, perhaps the most famous words in that were, when Mexico send their people, they're not sending their best. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. Nice of him to have the little caveat at the end, but what everybody, of course, picks up on was the drugs, crime, and rapists line. The Build the Wall chant, as Deborah's talked about, regular chant at his campaign rallies. And Trump would often talk about crimes committed by illegal immigrants or undocumented aliens, illegal immigrants, as he would say, while in the US, and by other immigrants while in the US. And we very emotively have the parents on stage of people who have been killed in that manner. And that's clearly a very emotional way of making a point. But the data on this is that actually immigrants have lower crime rates than native-born Americans. So it was a very misleading presentation, I guess. What's he done? Well, built a little bit of wall, not much. But actually, I think that focus just on the lack of war misses the extent of change that there has been. There's been really some quite significant change, not all to do with the southern border. A lot of it is to do with the southern border, clearly. So we've got the travel ban, which isn't to do with the southern border, 12 countries, 8 Muslim majority countries. But perhaps the most notoriously in terms of the southern border was the deliberate policy of child separation, which was separating through late 2017, 2018, separating kids from their parents. And kids in cages, as it became known, just quite extraordinary. And the malpractice in terms of actually keeping paperwork on what was going on. So when the policy was formally ended, many kids and parents didn't meet up for a long time because there were no proper records kept of which kids had been separated. I mean, it's just mind-numbing. Other things which they've done, which may seem a little bit in the weeds, but actually really matter. So in terms of people who are actually legally in the US with papers, so to speak, who are applying for permanent residency or citizenship, all sorts of things have been put in place to delay the process for getting permanent status and for citizenship applications. There's been an expansion of something called the public charge rule, and this is where immigrants with papers who want to apply for legal status, if they've relied on any government welfare programs, then that's a black mark against them in terms of getting legal status, and that used to affect very few people. Recent changes suggested it's going to affect a lot more people if that's allowed to stand in the future. Again, people have talked about asylum policy, and this is to do with people coming up from Central America. And the Trump administration was, these are people who not necessarily saying that they're seeking asylum from their government, which is what I guess is the standard feeling of what we think of asylum, but these are people who are genuinely fearing because of the lack of government almost in some of Central America and the chaos and the worry of that you can't bring families up safely and they're under direct threat. Trump has called this a hoax in terms of seeking asylum. I won't get, but has made it much more difficult for the asylum process to take any sort of shape, and it certainly meant people can't stay in the US while they're seeking asylum. If they've crossed the border from Mexico and come through Central America, they're not allowed to stay in the US while those asylum applications are processed. More generally, in terms of refugees, I know I ranted about this a couple of weeks ago. In 2020, the US government has set a limit of 18,000 people who will be resettled through refugee programs. That's scheduled to be reduced to 15,000 people next year if Trump stays in office. And just to give you an idea, in 2016, the last year of the Obama presidency, there were 110,000 people were settled through the refugee program. So there's a lot at stake in this election. Biden has certainly been pushed to the left. I don't think you're going to get the Biden of some of the Obama era in terms of certainly during the Democratic primaries, Biden was the most moderate, if that's the right word. I'm not sure it is, but I can't think of a better one in terms of immigration policy. And certainly Bernie Sanders and others were calling for a complete decriminalization, not that it wasn't going to be an offense of any sort to cross the border without papers. Biden did not sign on to that idea and still hasn't signed on to it. But as I say, it has been pushed to the left somewhat as the Democratic Party's just moved to the left. So Biden has promised to try and push through a comprehensive immigration reform package, similar to the one that failed in 2013-14, which would give many millions a path to legal status. He's promised to roll back certainly things like the public charge rule and those other rules and regulations, which really do matter in terms of people's quality of life. And some of that might not be as simple to do as you might think in terms of these rule changes, but Biden has promised to roll them back. He's got a 51-page document. It's 51 points in a 22-page document on his website about his immigration policies. If you really want to spend an hour looking at that, you can. Just a reflection on public opinion, actually, before I talk about the more immediate politics. There seems to have been a little bit of a shift in public opinion while Trump's been in power. I had the numbers and I've now lost them, towards a more liberal public stance on immigration policy. Slight shift in numbers, saying more from 2017 to 2020, slightly more people being willing to accept more immigrants. Now that would be legal rather immigration, but there's also seems to be more public opinion supportive of comprehensive immigration reform as well than there was. So oddly, Trump's rhetoric seems to have shifted public opinion in the opposite direction. It certainly hasn't shifted. I think Zalfa mentioned Customs and Border Patrol and ICE and the other organisations, institutions in the federal government, executive agencies which implement. Supposed I would have thought to be neutral and just do what they're told. But the CBP, Customs and Border Patrol, released a video on their website last month called The Got Away, I'll just find, I'm going to quote from the, if I can find the right bit here, I'm going to quote from NPR's, National Public Radio's review of this video eventually. And yeah, their description of this video is CB Customs and Border Patrol produced an ominous fictionalized video on their YouTube channel depicting a Latino migrant who had just escaped from agents attacking and knifing a man in a dark alley. So that's, you know, that's what the people who are meant to be neutrally doing the job of producing. At a rally in August, Trump, what did he talk about? He was talking about undocumented aliens, immigrants, and so we don't want them here, we want them outside. We got sued all over the place and we won. So now they don't come into the United States, they can wait outside. So anti-immigration sentiment is still a constant theme of Trump's politics. Just quickly on what's going to happen. But having said all of that, what is confounds logic is that Trump looks like he's going to get a higher proportion of the Latino vote in 2020 than he got in 2016. Now, one feature of this is, as I said at the start, and Alpha and Deborah have both clearly indicated, the talk of the Latino population is just a gross misnomer. You know, it's grouping together all sorts of people who are really quite diverse and different. And just in terms of polling, what pollsters would say, you've got a very diverse group. And when you break that group down into its diversity, so to speak, yeah, you get a lot of smaller groups and you just get a lot of noise. It just gets really difficult to work out what's going on. But still, it does seem, if you do demographic calculations, that Trump's looking at getting around 30+% of the Latino vote, which is a bit surprising. And I'm not sure how I'd explain that. I guess Trump does very well amongst Latinos. For points on the economy seems to be the best indicator of why that's the case. Just quickly, the 5 states with the highest Latino population. I'll finish quickly now. California, New York, New Jersey, Florida, and Texas. Where this really matters is in Texas, Florida, sorry, and the Latino population in Florida is very distinct. Thank you, George. With a large Cuban migrant population, Venezuelan migrant population as well, both of whom are very motivated by rhetoric about the dangers of socialism, given how they interpret events in those two countries. So, and that may well tip Florida. Just in terms of electoral politics, Florida, if Biden wins Florida, Biden wins the election. And oddly, 20 years on, Florida might be an early, those of you who remember 2000, waiting for Florida really was like waiting for, but Florida might be an early indicator. Florida are counting ballots cast early, they're counting before election day. So Florida might come in with a predicted result quite early on. And if Biden wins Florida, then I'll go to bed happy. Some of you may not. If Trump wins Florida, it doesn't mean Trump's going to win, but it just means we're in for a long night. So I'll stop waffling at that point. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Alex. It's ominous and exciting. Last little bit of prediction. Great. So thank you, fellow presenters, and dear students and viewers. Would you like to ask your questions? Give me some time to type. That's fair enough. Wait, so from all three, I guess. Oh, George. Yes, you may.
I guess
actually speak.
Just while everybody else is typing away. I guess it's interesting. Again, I'm coming at this from a historian's point of view. I don't know why I'm apologising for that. I'm not apologising for that. I'm coming at this from a historian's point of view. And I guess in very broad terms, historically, those immigrants who have faced prejudice because of their ethnicity or background, all the way back to the 1920s, have in less than a generation, they have supported the kind of restrictions that would not have seen them granted access to begin with, the kind of nativist basis of that East Coast and West Coast situation. And I guess the current First Lady provides quite an interesting case in point where she wouldn't have survived Trump's own views on immigration. But I wonder whether you have a sense, and this you alluded to it with Alex, with your idea of what Hispanics voters were going to do. Have those recent migrants from South and Central America, when they have gained citizenship rights, are they closing the door behind them?
That's a very good question, especially if you're a historian, George, if you don't mind me saying so. The evidence is, and that doesn't seem to be what's motivating, in terms of motivating any support for Trump. It's more, I think, a genuine, particularly that Trump is, particularly, say, for Venezuela and some of the other countries with leftist regimes that who've left those countries, that they support Trump's anti-leftist rhetoric, and I'm sorry. So that seems to be more of a. It doesn't seem to be based necessarily on restrictionist sentiment, that we don't want any more migrants coming from our countries, so to speak. Though there is a distinction, I guess, between what legal, documented and undocumented immigrants. Again, if people, there is some polling. It's a little bit, again, noisy, unclear. There is a "we did it legally, other people should do it legally" message that comes through a little bit. But generally, I don't think it's restrictionist sentiment is particularly strong amongst the Latino community. And I just, in terms of, certainly the Republican Party didn't think this was a winning strategy. One thing I didn't mention was in the aftermath of the 2012 election, where Mitt Romney had rather bizarrely talked about self-deportation as a strategy for undocumented immigrants. The Republican National Committee, led by Reince Priebus, produces this report called the postmortem, called the autopsy report, and on the 2012 campaign, and basically says we have to get away from this. We have to pass a comprehensive immigration reform bill. We have to leave the issue of immigration behind us because it's costing us so much with the Latino community. Now, clearly that's not what happened. And I don't want to exaggerate Trump's support amongst the Latino community. The polling, as I say, is very noisy, is very uncertain. George Bush got over 40% of the Latino vote in 2004. So to see Latinos as an automatically Democratic constituency anyway is misleading. It's just that Trump did so badly in 2016 that it's surprising that he's rebounded a bit in 2020. I'll stop talking there. But I don't think the evidence is pulling up the drawbridge, going back to your original question, in that sense. I don't think the evidence would support that quite yet. I mean, maybe it will in 20 years' time, but I don't think we're there yet. Well, not that we want to get there, I don't think. It wasn't as good an answer as your question, George. Apologies.
It was. In the end, it was.
Thank you, boss.
Right, moving on. Martin asks, why do the panelists think that the closest neighbors of the US were mentioned so little in the presidential and VP debates of the last 2 weeks? Good question, Martin. Alex, you're nodding. Do you have?
No, I think it's a good question. I'm not sure I've got a clear answer to that. That is a good question. And in some ways, it's why Trump hasn't put more emphasis on immigration in those debates. I haven't got a good answer, to be honest. Other things haven't gun. I mean, there's lots of issues that haven't been mentioned that you might expect. Gun control, for example, never gets a mention. So, but given how Trump's played on that, it's a good question. I haven't got an answer.
I mean, purely speculatively, I would just say that there's so much going on domestically and the 2020 factor of, good God, what's happening to us all? There's that internalized focus on very divisive moment in American politics, American society more broadly. the all-consuming coronavirus situation, is dominating news cycles on a daily basis. So I think the relative lack of attention paid to not entirely to international matters, but particularly to immediate closest neighbours that you would expect to, certainly in comparison to the previous election. I think that's got to be part of the explanation. But like Alex, I'm not basing that on anything other than just gut feeling.
I don't think I have anything specific to add, except just in terms of unaccompanied children. It is those two specific neighbours that have, I'm trying to think of the right words here because I know there are legal distinctions, that have an agreement with the United States that anybody who passes through their border to the US can be automatically deported back across that border. This is a process called voluntary return. So if you cross the border at the US-Mexico border, say, and you've come through Mexico, which is the very nature of said border, you're automatically returned. And Mexico's signed on to this. So I mean, I wonder how much complicity there is there. But yeah, I don't think that's actually responding to your question, Martin. We've got loads of other ones, so sorry. Grace Robinson, great question. Was 9/11 a distinct point that caused immigration to the US to become so brutal?
That is a really good question. And it's certainly, we get the DHS, Department of Homeland Security, set up in the wake of that. The only thing I'd say a little bit is, and Bush is not brutal on immigration. And one of the things I should have said in some ways was one of the things that Trump has done is he's changed the Republican Party. And the Republican Party is always a little bit ambiguous. I mentioned Eric Cantor when he was defeated. The Republican Party, though, from Reagan through to George Bush Jr., was a little bit divided on immigration policy. In 1986, Reagan signs into law a really quite liberal immigration reform bill. 2006, 2007, George W. Bush tries to work with congressional Democrats to get through what by most standards would be a relatively liberal immigration reform bill. And as I say, Bush did well amongst Latino voters. So it's a very logical question. But I don't think it affects the southern border. I think it changes over opinion and certainly generates all sorts of unwelcome sentiments. But maybe I don't think 9/11 is something that's distinctly about the southern border, even though it does give the federal government all sorts of powers, which it can then use at the southern border in terms of immigration at the southern border. But it's a good question. I'm trying to think of a better answer.
That's great, Grace. You've befuddled us. Deborah, did you want to add anything, or shall I move to the next question?
I am muted. No, I don't have anything to add on that question. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for that, Grace. Okay, we've got one from Craig. Do you believe that the different candidates have differing views on relations with the more prosperous countries such as Argentina, Chile, and Brazil? And if so, how do you think they will shape foreign policy in the region? I'm going to say up front that Alexander Hamilton didn't say anything about these other countries, so I have no response to this. But I will leave the answers to my more learned colleagues.
I don't have a detailed answer to this question. A short answer is yes, I think the different candidates will have different views on relations with each of those countries. But in terms of how that would actually manifest in terms of foreign policy in the region, it partly depends on what happens in each of those countries in electoral terms as well. So I think sort of building on what I was saying about Brazil earlier, it's clear that Trump and Bolsonaro are close bedfellows and fellow travelers in many directions. But whether or not Bolsonaro is going to survive the various catastrophes that are clustering around him, he's enjoying very high popularity ratings at the moment, but that wasn't the case a couple of months ago, and it probably won't be the case in another couple of months' time. So it's quite a volatile situation in Brazil. I can't quite think off the top of my head what the different point in electoral cycles Argentina and Chile are in at the moment, although I know Chile's got a lot of problems with authoritarian policing at the moment, and similarly to stuff that we've seen in the United States. But I think on the whole, Biden would be adopting a more interventionist approach in terms of certainly in terms of environmental issues, so sort of connecting up to the subsequent question that I've noticed there in terms of whether actually enforcing those kinds of economic sanctions on the situation in the Amazon would be overstepping the bounds. I mean, I think for the United States to take that action on a unilateral basis would be overstepping. But as part of the Paris Agreement and an international community intervening to protect a global resource, which is effectively what the Amazon is, would not only be not overstepping, but it would be a very responsible thing to do. And the other point about the Amazon to stress that sort of connects back to this previous question is that it doesn't just belong to Brazil, even though Bolsonaro often pretends that it does. The Amazon stretches across parts of it across 7 or 8 different countries in South America, and there are equally ravaging fires affecting other rainforested and really environmentally important parts of Argentina, Paraguay, and Bolivia as well right at the moment. So concerted international action to protect natural resources, environmental protections, and the people who live in those terrains are absolutely essential and responsible courses of action to take. And I think it's clear that we won't get that from Trump, but we might see a Biden policy that works in terms of international cooperation to achieve that.
Well, yeah, and thank you, Hannah, for that question. Really good question. Did you want to add anything, Alex? You're on mute.
Fantastic. I think Deborah's knowledge surpasses mine quite comprehensively. Bolsonaro, I think it is interesting that Bolsonaro's approval at the moment is quite decent. I mean, party politics has collapsed in Brazil, so it's quite a different institutional framework than the US. But yeah, it's I don't know. The one person who's more bonkers than Trump is doing well. I don't know. It's bizarre. Or maybe AMLO as well. I don't know. We could debate the relative merits or demerits of different populists.
Maybe we leave that for another
different day, yes.
No, I mean, in all honesty, it is quite baffling. The levels of popularity for entirely different reasons, I think, in the Mexican case and the Brazilian case, but the approval ratings that Bolsonaro and AMLO currently enjoy are mind-boggling. It's not an easy thing to explain. I don't pretend to understand it. I mean, probably giving it a lot of thought would help, or a lot more thought than I have done. That came out totally wrong. But it's a very volatile situation in terms of swings of popular support. A lot of it is to do with the way that the pandemic is developing, but also in terms of how it's being reported and how it's affecting different communities. So I think this is the case in the United States as well, in terms of where the impact of all of these different things are being felt on multiple levels. The health impacts, the unemployment impacts, the broader social impacts as well are being concentrated in some communities and not others, some parts of the country and not others. And that's, I mean, Alex has talked very, importantly in terms of the Latino vote in the United States, the different geographical kind of distribution, the very different constituencies that you have from Florida compared to California, compared to New York. Brazil and Mexico are equally massive countries with equally huge demographic diversity from one part of the country to the other, huge disparities in class, social divisions as well, and the political political opinion and support for one person over the other or one party over the other doesn't map neatly onto those things always. So unpicking what exactly is happening at this particular moment in time is mind-boggling. But it could look very different in 3 weeks, a month, 2 months time. So who knows?
Okay, I think we have one last question. So if anybody has a burning question that they absolutely cannot keep in anymore, do type it in. We'll take one after this. But Martin is asking, well, commenting on the fact that we didn't mention Puerto Rico, quite right. Does PR have a role to play in the 2024 presidential election? I wonder whether they are more people. The Puerto Rican voting community in Florida has an important role to play in this election. Of course, wasn't it a couple of days ago that Trump was speaking to, saying that he was the best thing that happened to Puerto Rico, and that they better vote for him, even though they can't vote. So there is probably something more coherent to be said there, but I'm just incredulous at this stage. Alex, Deborah?
Well, I guess if Puerto Rico is a state by 2024, then it would have something. And there is a movement amongst Democrats actually to push for statehood, particularly for DC. It's not actually clear what public opinion is in Puerto Rico, whether it's overwhelmingly in favor of statehood. But as Zalfa says, whether the Puerto Rican community who've recently moved to Florida, whether they can vote and would vote is problematic. Not problematic, but it's unknown. You'd imagine, given that the administration didn't really treat Puerto Rico particularly well in the aftermath of Hurricane, I've forgotten the name, might hurt the Trump campaign in Florida. It's difficult to know. Should be. I mean, I'm avoiding the Puerto Rico side of it, but in Florida, the Trump campaign has been much more organized than the Biden campaign amongst the Latino community, which is a point I should have mentioned earlier. Puerto Rico's statehood is the bigger issue, I think, in the longer term, because the assumption is that DC would certainly add 2 Democratic senators and that Puerto Rico would probably add 2 more Democratic senators. I mean, why Puerto Rico doesn't have statehood, I have no idea, really. I mean, it's disenfranchisement. It's ridiculous. Same
with DC.
Yeah.
In terms of voting, in terms of representation.
Yeah, and they've got bigger population. DC's got a bigger it wouldn't be the smallest state. I mean, so.
Okay, if there are no additional questions, I think we can virtually thank our panelists, Deborah and Alex, and on the shoulder. Thank you very much for coming along this evening, and thank you to everyone else who has stuck around. We will be back here at 6 o'clock next Thursday to talk about Black Lives Matter and the movement's relationship to the election, and looking forward to it. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, everybody. Bye.